Thank you all. Today is going to be structured vaguely like a conversation with various stops along the way. It occurred to me that it would be useful for us to think for a moment about the act of looking and seeing, about how art as an activity leads us to some place, but where that place is inside ourselves, not in the canvas in many cases. And this exhibition and Natalie's working practice is an excellent example of seeing, which means to observe, to locate in that close observation an understanding of what one sees and the ideas that it contains, the references to history, to culture, to what it means personally. I first became aware of her work on a trip to LA. I had an opportunity to see work in a studio. She has had 2 exhibitions at Ace Gallery, and this is her first here in Santa Fe. And in many ways, it's the first on a number of levels. It's the first time this body of work has been really seen in a public way. And for Charlotte Jackson Gallery, it's the first foray into imagery in many years, if ever. And so when you walk in the door, there is a surprise on 2 levels. Paintings in which you can physically and mentally think of yourself entering, and work that confronts you with another reality and another time. Unlike the beauty of monochromatic canvases and simple form brought to its aesthetic resolution. Natalie's work covers a broad range of subjects. As a scientist and a scholar, she's curious and interested in the phenomenon of seeing and the difference when it becomes looking and the cursoriness of that. And so I wanted to briefly talk about the earlier series because they are the key to what we see around us in the canvases today. Many of which, we're looking at a compression of about 5 to 6 years of active painting, although a lifetime spent with access to art and encouraged to move in the visual arts as she drifted ever more closely to the ocean she loves and the marine biology that will fill the next 5 years in strong ways. Her earlier series incorporate a number of things that have much in common. All of them, interestingly, are outdoors. They are not spaces that we occupy, but spaces in which we move. There are the ocean pictures, the waves, the pictures of the sharks, which have formed part of her study in marine biology, service stations at night, a great LA subject, and a subject which offers a key to some of what we experience in the paintings around us. Fireworks, lightning storms, airplanes, roads and tracks, railroad tracks, metaphors for travel and transit. And all of these things, you've come to each of them for a reason, an association. Have you, in first starting to paint them, what captured your need to make them images? What made the need?
Well, it's so interesting when you talk about, it's a question you get as an artist a lot, how do you decide what you're going to paint? And there's sort of 3 components that go into that decision-making process, and one is intellectual, so you pick imagery that you think is interesting and will be intriguing. But then there's also this emotional and aesthetic components that a lot of it happens sort of subconsciously, and I think that's where that need comes from. And all of my work has, I think, sort of this strong implied narrative, but up until this current body of work and a few others, it's been this very ambiguous narrative. And so I've chosen these symbols that are sort of universally relatable, but become personal because of their ambiguity and universal relatability. So airplanes and roads and gas stations, we all have experienced these settings in our personal lives, and then creating these sort of misty atmospheric representations of these different scenes.
Well, and I think that's the interesting thing, aesthetically, is the way that you've chosen to use the atmosphere of night, of fog, of reflected light, deflected light, to create a sense of otherness about a common experience, a common place. Not unlike filmmakers in film noir, you've looked for an atmosphere or a way of rendering and representing this thing. It's particularly effective, I think, in the shark paintings.
Thank you.
There's something about the experience of water. Does that come from your own experience as a surfer, as a snorkeler, as a scuba diver?
I've spent a lot of time underwater.
There's an authenticity to that experience, which panics me, of course.
It has a very similar aesthetic feel. I think my very early work deals a lot with fog, and as that introduction stated, I'm interested in sort of that line between representational and figurative representation, and I use fog and mist and this sort of thick atmosphere to sort of obscure that line. And there's something about presenting a viewer with a picture that isn't well defined and isn't complete, that we like to have clearly delineated lines and clear imagery. And so in obscuring an image, I think it's an interesting tactic for engaging a viewer, in that we want to fill in those lines. We want to complete a picture. And so that's a tactic I use for viewer engagement.
Well, and effectively, because you find yourself, particularly as the scale of your pictures has changed from easel size to wall size. Although you're still, as we've seen, making these intimate little sketch paintings of a night scene. You've given the audience a clue to the body of work around us and your work practice inadvertently. You're very analytical. And as art is sometimes thought of as an emotive or an intuitive response, it is that dance that you sort of start standing in the rational and then move toward the irrational or the intuitive and then back. Do you spend a lot of time, other than this current body of work, researching, thinking about, developing a series of criteria for the paintings that you've done in the past?
And what do you mean by criteria?
A decision to use an image, service station, a decision to paint it at night or emerging from a coastal fog, another decision. And then the analytics of, as a resident of New Mexico, Judy Chicago famously said in her book, Through the Flower, I wanted every decision to be my decision and my choice. Size, color, image, material. And she made a point of that in early feminist art history. That was art school, but individualizable. So how do you approach then the setting up the parameters of the problem you're going to solve in the painting?
Well, I think each of the series that you outlined and a few others have started with either an image that I reacted to very strongly or an experience. Almost all of them have. And so I'm thinking of, I did a series of the Shanghai skyline in the smog. And the inspiration for that series came from, I was a teaching assistant in an Introduction to Environmental Science course. And we had a lecturer come in and talk about air quality.
An exciting topic, one that's desperate. But...
And he started his talk with these beautiful images of what looked like cityscapes in the fog. And of course, being someone who uses fog in my work and is aesthetically drawn to that kind of imagery, I reacted to, oh, what a great idea, that would make a great painting. But these images became deeply disturbing when you realize it isn't fog, it's smog. And hundreds of thousands of people are dying in China every year because the air quality is so poor.
Yeah, the material, the metal particulate and the poison in the air.
Right, and so I had this idea, I reacted from an aesthetic level and an emotional level to those images and ended up making paintings based on them. And so it's interesting when you ask, as I was talking about a minute ago, there's sort of these different components of intellect, emotion, and aesthetics that go into deciding what kind of art to make. And I think I usually start from an emotional place where I need to react strongly and feel strongly enough that it's important and interesting and evocative before I decide to actually make a painting. And there are many things that I've thought about painting, and if weeks later I'm not still feeling pulled to create that type of imagery, then I rarely end up.
Yeah. So do you keep notebooks or sketch pads, or many artist studios are full of things pinned to a wall, an image that caught an eye, an edge, a color, a piece of fabric?
I have drawers and drawers of photographs, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, good. It promises many years of painting. That's, all of that makes some sense. It continues to create an arc and of activity that is defining a landscape of the studio practice. Mm-hmm. That it, for you, will always be, as it seems to be, a dance between your mind and the effect you're creating to try and move toward it. In all of the pictures I've seen from the earlier series, there is a coolness, a slight distancing that, and could you talk about that? Because your initial impulse is an emotional reaction. It's probably not a shark coming at you in the ocean as you're scuba diving. It's probably an interesting experience, but your reaction is much cooler than the president's to sharks as a whole. And how, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what that process of cooling the image is. What's your intention?
Cooling in the sense of color palette, or cooling?
No. Maybe the emotional or the tenor, the emotional tenor of the work. That is, it's not hysteria.
And it's subtle.
It's not panic. It's subtle, and it's more elusive than specific.
Yes.
Is that? Are we seeing the emergence of the artist's personality, or is it an intentional choice to open a door in a different way? It's not throwing the door open.
Right.
It's as if the door is.
Well, I think that. So what I try to create in my work is I try to create pieces that are emotionally evocative, but in, I guess, a subtle way. And I think that was particularly important to the way that I decided to approach this series, is that I like the metaphor of opening a door where I sort of set a stage for you to have an emotional experience or an intellectual experience looking at a painting. But I've approached all of these different series from a strong reaction to the subject material, but part of what I love about many of my earlier works is that people have a very broad range of reactions, and so for some people that railroad painting when you first walk in the gallery is serene, and for other people it's very disturbing. And I like that I'm able to evoke a large range of emotions, and that's something that I actively seek to create.
Well, and the Roads and the Tracks series, that there is both the romanticism of the highway and the train, which was for the 19th century, the vehicle that took you to a new identity, a new place, a new life, a chance to reset and rethink. In the context of the paintings, there are all those possibilities, and the roads with the two yellow lines, like Highway 1 or California coast.
Exactly.
Kind of into that fog and then out and then back. They are ambiguous, but specific. And I've always found that kind of exciting in the work, that there's the ambiguity of what I should feel, or what, if I'm walking in and not feeling anything, as opposed, you're not demanding in a polemical way a participation in the painting down a narrow path you've chosen, but rather the spur or the kind of open door.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of, so I talked about there being a strong implied narrative, and so I sort of like to think that I'm presenting you with a starting point and not necessarily the beginning of a narrative, but you're sort of entering into an ongoing. I think that a lot of my paintings, people have a reaction that there is a strong feeling that something has either just happened or something is about to happen. And I think that makes for a very interesting intellectual engagement with a lot of my paintings.
Yeah, particularly the subject matter suggests that, and then we all have relationships to those things, whether they're fears or pleasure. And in the current body of work, which we'll come to, there is certainly that not exploitation, but a further expansion of that. Moving from events and things in the outdoors, in air, in light, in reflected light, or water, to move to this group of work is to make another choice about how and what you're representing and how you're finding it. And I'd like to pursue that, I think, further, in that you have, with this body of work, a triggering incident, like your emotional reaction to the pictures of Shanghai, the realization that then led you to think about them. There was a triggering event for these pictures, and it came from another body of work in which you had been locating a different set of emotion. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I had been making these paintings of roads and railroad tracks in the fog, which for me were very much about this sort of implied narrative of travel and the societal implications of these different technologies that have sort of shaped who we are and what our culture is like today. And I had a group of people come through my studio on a tour, and a woman broke down in front of one of my railroad track paintings because she had had a family member who was a prisoner at Auschwitz. And so it was this sort of profound moment for me where I have, like I said, always tried to create a strong emotional setting in all of my work, but it was the first time that I had realized how powerful of emotion I could evoke, and also that I could potentially reference a specific time and place or engage with the historical narrative in my work. And so from that incident, I started researching the Holocaust, and there are so many organizations and institutions that have archives of thousands of photographs that are easily accessible, and so I started looking at lots of source material and found that I was drawn to historical images documenting the spaces in concentration camps, and I couldn't stop thinking about these images, which are these rooms that are often these concrete, stark spaces that are pretty unremarkable in appearance, and the contrast between the ordinary appearance and the horror and purpose of these spaces haunted me. And I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but I do think that if you go and you visit a place where something monumental or horrible has happened, spaces can carry the feeling of those events. And so I started thinking about how in a painting I could create that sort of empathic connection to historical events.
Oh, okay. It's very interesting because rather than the gate of the camp appearing in a fog, it is a room in which the air is heavy with history and heavy with the silence that these rooms have. And when you visit the death camps, So in doing this, you began to respond to specific rooms as a source, and then you begin to think about how to represent that and the scale it needed to be second. Because these pictures are much larger.
Yes.
This is perhaps the biggest one that you've made yet, or is there another one?
One painting larger. This is the second largest I've ever made.
Yeah. And they become architectural spaces that you enter.
Well, and I wanted them to be an experience, not just looking at a painting, but I wanted it to be a sort of visceral, physical experience in engaging with this work.
And that's important because, John Berger said that it's all about choice. The way we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. It's shaped by scale and color and openness and closeness. And so I think that's important. It is as if we are sitting in the room behind us as a backdrop because of the scale. It's in looking at the images, they are often almost cinematic in the way that the highways and things like that. That anticipation, the tension of something vaguely seen or not known. I shared these with colleagues at the museum, and they came to it with a range of experience. And I'm certain, as you've shared them with people who visited you, you've discovered there's a wide range of response. How have your feelings changed as you began to think about the series and the intensity of what they were about started to work and change as you make the paintings? You are a formalist. I've just stacked too many things here I'm sorry, I tend to do this. It's clear from your earlier series, you're a formalist and you like the reduction to essential and essences of fog, of the initial sighting of something, of the memory. And so in these works that surround us, there is an essentializing or an aestheticizing of these objects. Did that come initially, or have these paintings had a life where you struggled to get that surface and that?
So it's interesting that you say that. The first oil painting class I ever took, my teacher said that a good painting takes an idea and distills in a picture what is interesting about that idea. And so every body of work that I approach, I try to figure out what is it that draws me to this image, and how much detail do I need to preserve? How much do I need to obfuscate certain parts of this image to really draw attention to the parts that make it the most engaging? That
kind of intellectual, formal editing
right.
that pushes the viewer to see what you want them to see.
And one of the things that I have found fascinating over the past years is that people often will look at my work or look at a photograph of my work and say, oh wow, your paintings are so realistic. But if you get up close to these paintings, I mean, the lines are very blurred, and often they are not photorealistic, and I don't aim to be photorealistic, but I think that part of where that instinct when people say that comes from is that I think I do often capture the feeling of the space, and that tends to ring very true with people. And so they equate that with sort of that photorealism, even though they aren't.
Yeah, well, I think it's because the eye picks up what you've captured as light is essential in your work. It's a very interesting notion how it's not the edge, as is often the case in an abstract work, that defines you. For you, it's the way the surface, you give us the reflectivity or the absorption of a surface as it moves and defines itself in space. And then there's the ambiguousness of the edge of a door frame as it intersects a wall, or a window as it opens to a space that is not defined. There may not even be a pencil line inside the oil, and that shifts these things to a series of experiences that are maybe the coolness I was thinking of, because they are about
Yeah.
reflected and absorbed light as much as they are about water or place.
And so to get back to your question asking about these specific works, these paintings are incredibly difficult to work on, part of which is just by nature of what I'm depicting. But I also felt like, and so it took me years between having that interaction with the woman who reacted strongly to my railroad painting and making these paintings. And part of that was because it's a daunting topic to take on, and I wanted to do it in a way that was respectful and was sort of contributing to the way that we talk about and remember the Holocaust. And many of my previous series have worked from photographs, but I never felt the same almost pressure to honestly and to honestly portray a space and to be true to the essence of these rooms. And so it's hard for me that analytical science part of my brain wanted to depict these spaces perfectly. But as I just said it's often as a painter you make these decisions to add or omit information to prioritize the feeling of a space that you're portraying.
Right. Well, because for many people, the Holocaust is about the murder of human beings, the millions of people who were exterminated, mostly by guns and bullets, it turns out, that rather than the gas chambers that were the final solution. And those heinous acts have a specific nature and an emotional tenor that is horrific to experience. And when I walked into the gallery the other day, I didn't have that horrific experience, but I discovered that I was feeling this brooding sadness for myself. But my response is shaped by, like so many things, what one knows and when and where you see something is how you then it affects what you see. And I find it interesting to try and create a stable image of place without the evidence of the act. And yet the place is somehow complicit in the act, in the acts that took place, in the horrors. And I'm curious about you, if you could talk a little bit more about how you balanced and tried to find this thing. Because you went on to, you did research. These paintings were all done before you visited Poland, but you had an opportunity and you went to Poland and went to the camps. And I think it might be interesting to sort of link the before and the after.
Sure. Yeah, so this sort of goes back to that early decision-making process of deciding that I wanted to make paintings that would take on the Holocaust as a subject. And there's a strong legacy of many artists have made paintings and films and taken photographs of places and people who experienced or were part of the Holocaust. And so figuring out how myself as an individual and as an artist was going to engage in this narrative. And I think it comes back to that sort of coolness that you're talking about, is that my work is very subtle, and I like to set a stage that you then fill with your own experience. And so part of why I decided to paint historical photographs, and I've continued to work on this series, and I'm now working on some photographs or some paintings from photographs that I took after visiting the camps, but this idea of people coming into the camps after they were liberated and documenting these spaces, and this idea of bearing witness and coming in and seeing the horror, seeing victims, seeing the bodies of the horror of what took place. And so it was an interesting perspective, I thought, too. These images represent people going in and reconciling what happened to these people, and these are the spaces in which these events took place. That
That raises an interesting question, it's a branch about the titling decision. Because in and of the specificity of the date you put on the picture is not about its creation, but it's about the moment at which the camp was liberated. Some dates of which turns out difficult to figure out. The date it was liberated versus the date that people were finally released was different and horrifying. But they had to have somewhere to go. So, why did you decide not to name the room or the camp versus a date at which this room's functions stopped and changed?
Right. I think that part of why I wanted to, so obviously if you come and you see this show, we have literature for people to look at so you can sort of get more experience, but I think that as paintings on their own, another aspect of being an artist is I feel strongly that I want to create paintings that are evocative and successful on their own and don't necessarily need an artist statement to accompany them to be successful. And so I think that, and so I have had people come and view these paintings before when they were still in my studio and I wouldn't tell them what they were looking at. And it has been very interesting to sort of experience other people's experience of, some people understand right away what they're looking at, which in and of itself I think is fascinating and speaks to the gravity of this imagery.
And it also reveals their link or their knowledge. It may also be their age, that they understand them because they have had experiences that they bring to looking, to the observing. But go ahead.
Yeah, and so another component of this, so I am not Jewish, and this is not a part of my family history or personal history, but as a human being, I felt moved to make these works, and part of why I think those dates are an important part of this body of work is that those are sort of the dates when the rest of the world began to be aware of what was happening here, and much of what the Nazi regime carried out was carried out in secrecy. Not everyone in Germany who was a civilian knew what was going on, even though that's a whole other topic. But sort of this idea of when that turning point occurred of the rest of us finding out what was happening and how we bridge that gap between victims, survivors, and perpetrators, and how the rest of us come to terms with what happened in these places and what does that mean for our morality and going forward, how we treat each other.
I'm not going to be ageist. It's an interesting perspective that as, sorry, I got too close. Getting too close to it. But it's, I find my relationship to the Holocaust was shaped by a number of things, and I refused to go to Germany or Austria until the mid-'80s when my job forced me to go, because I don't believe in innocence of the unknown, the unknowing or the unrecognized. But it is, at this moment, 50 years later, still the worst thing that has happened in the 20th century. I am encouraged and confused by something you've said that is, I think, generational about our generation's relationship to the past and to this event. And the clear, because of our earlier discussions, the clear parallels with what's currently is happening around the world again. With the demonization of people, the cruelty, the hate, and the generating of all of the things that precluded and inspired and fired the Holocaust, and this heinous acts. And so it's perhaps a reflection of being able to intellectually look at something and understand its parts. And for many in my generation and older, there is a complication of separating the raw emotion that it still generates, which when we come to these paintings, we may fall into or experience again, or may not, because you've been able to capture an essence of a place and suggest what has occurred here. But the room is not complicit the way a human being is complicit.
Yes.
It is, at the end of the day, a space.
It is a space, but so I'm just thinking in 50 years, all of the survivors will be gone. And sort of...
Maybe in 10 years.
Maybe in 10 years. But when we look back... okay, 10 years, whatever. In the future, these people will be gone, and there are organizations that are recording and documenting people's stories, but there's something about being in a place where something happened that I think makes it real in a way that reading about the Holocaust or looking at photographs. So you mentioned I went to Auschwitz and Majdanek, and I had been making these paintings and spending a lot of time thinking about these events. And when I walked into this room, so this is the gas chamber at Auschwitz I, and it became real and devastating and perspective altering in a way that it hadn't before, because genocide is this horrible thing. We talk about 6 million Jews were murdered, and it's a huge number, but it's incomprehensible. The scale is what is so horrifying. Many things are horrifying, but one of the things that is so baffling is the scale of the Holocaust. And going and standing in a space where thousands of people were murdered, it became real to me in a way that it hadn't before. And I think that that's something that my generation struggles with, is the way that we digest information and share information.
And authenticate it.
And authenticate it is a really interesting, it's changing so quickly, and I think that because of how much we can consume on our phones and our tablets, on our laptops, there is sort of this emotional distancing. And the experience of what I hoped that I'm able to capture in these paintings is something of that same experience of going and visiting these places.
Yeah. And, I think that this answers a question I was going to ask about how you've been changed by making this work, and also how your perspective has changed. Perspective is an anonymous term. How you've talked about how it changed when you walked in this room. I had a very similar experience in this room. And to come away from that room and then to interact with people who haven't been there, who haven't experienced that, who understand and are sympathetic and horrified by the history of this place, is then to understand somehow the gap that happens as the events of that day become more and more distant and become less and more formalized in photographs and text, without the resonances of that emotional experience. So has that experience changed the later paintings? Has it made them more difficult or more complex to realize?
Yes. All of these paintings were incredibly difficult to paint. And after going, I visited Poland in December, and I was devastated for about a month. I couldn't do anything. It was this profoundly perspective-altering experience, and I don't want to say that I was more cynical about people when I left, but I do think that we have there's a responsibility to hold each other accountable for how we behave and how we treat other people. And what is amazing about the Holocaust is, after World War II, the world said never again, and yet it has happened again and again. And it is happening right now in Myanmar and in Syria, and it continues to happen. And if we, as a global community, once said never again, how is it possible that it keeps happening? And I think that part of why it keeps happening is that when you hear statistics of horror, you can sympathize, but in order to change behavior, you need to be able to empathize and really imagine yourself or family members or people you care about going through these experiences. And I think that going and visiting these places really addresses that empathy question versus sympathy. And so going and having that experience, as devastating as it was very reaffirming that this is important work. It's an important topic that we need to be talking about. And I will continue to make these paintings. I have to I make one of these paintings. I have to paint other things for my sanity and my well-being, but I think it's important work, and I'm going to continue to make more.
Well, and I think the clarity that it's like right brain, left brain, that your scientific background and your analytic skills bring to what you're experiencing will blossom through the empathy you've connected with and the struggle it is to make these pictures. It is a complex thing. I give up. I didn't move. Maybe my tone shifted. We are at a crossroads as a culture, as a society. It's a crossroads in which generations find themselves estranged. Horrors we thought had settled have not been settled. And your work is part of the next generation that I feel attempting to come to terms with it that allow us all to enter and to be empathetic. For a long time, and in the Jewish community and in the museum I work at currently, there was a feeling about ownership. But it's not about the Jew as victim, it's about owning the loss. And I think these paintings, in the larger sense, speak to the need to recognize and reaffirm that humanity that we all share, and that culpability we own to see that it does not happen again, that it never happens again. And that means we have to change the way we respond to the Rohingya, to Syria, to the murder of black citizens. We have to find another voice. Art rarely is successful in doing that, historically. Goya's paintings didn't change the world he lived in. The Holocaust has produced reams of text and buildings full of artworks that succeed in screeching but not reaching an audience. And I hope that we can find in the quietude of paintings like yours a place to spring forward in action and hope. I think, does anyone like to ask questions? We've sort of moved through a good thing. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes. Yeah.
First of all, Natalie, and both of you, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. Sitting so close to the painting, I noticed that the walls are weeping. Is that your interpretation, or did you actually reproduce something that is there?
I mean, this is fascinating, and I apologize in advance for something very disturbing that I'm going to talk about in a second. But so I often, before I begin using oil paint, I do an acrylic underpainting, and so this is sort of a technique that I use to give more depth to what sometimes end up being very opaque surfaces. But I try to give it some depth, and I don't know that I would say that it's weeping, but it felt. I made a decision not to build up more paint over that texture and to leave it because I felt that it did convey some of the emotional feeling of that space. And when I went and I visited Auschwitz and I entered this room, many of the walls have claw marks as people tried to climb out of the room. And what haunted me was that I inadvertently created imagery that sort of mimicked the human marks that were left in that space. And I can't even describe what it felt like to enter that room and to realize that, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The choice of weeping is something that comes from inside you, and it mirrors something that we experience. In that room is dank. It's a dank and cold place, filled with marks. And the painting it conveys it, but doesn't record each mark, each desperate gesture. And so we have to find the weeping in ourselves.
And I really admire the lack of exploitation, because I think it's so easy to put some red indicating blood, or something showing the way. But here you really make each person look for the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and that was something that I strongly felt I did not want anyone to feel as though I was being disrespectful or exploitative. I really made these paintings from a place of being saddened as a human being and wanting to have other people engage with this history. So, thank you.
I think that I don't know you. I didn't go online. What do you look like? The fact that you are so young and you have, taken such an event that has blotted out the sun. I know how difficult it is for you, just because I've been creating images. And while you were describing the process, I could be wrong, but I can see you really struggling to just get something out in the air here. Because unless you're in your shoes or another artist's shoes, those of you who are absorbing this event, and even going to Auschwitz and walking in and seeing the claw marks, it's something else when you're sitting in front of a canvas and you're reliving the smell, and you're reliving the reverberation of sound and all the distraction of people around you. And it's just, they walk through a door, they turn off the light, but you're still sitting there creating this